Hey folks, this is Riker, and after an emergency hotfix, the Diablo 4 Season 5 PTR actually gave us some of the tools we needed to test the content. And results have been interesting. I think the new Infernal Hordes mode has a lot of promise. I actually really like it, but I'm concerned that other people may hate it. We'll talk about why in a second here, but we'll also talk about in this video the latest Last Epoch reveal of its upcoming big content update, which is looking really hype, as well as how the Elden Ring devs caved into players complaining about difficulty, and some more gaming news of the week. But first, Diablo 4. Now, early in the week, I released a video about my day one PTR experience, which ended in a rage quit after I was just frustrated at feeling like I couldn't test anything. On day 2, the devs released a hotfix that addressed my biggest issue, and while bugs remained, by that point we had a better understanding of what those bugs were, what was causing them, and how to work around them, for the most part. So starting day 2, my Season 5 PTR experience improved tremendously. I was actually able to play the new game mode Infernal Hordes, and I was having a good time in it. But before we move on, a quick word from this video's sponsor, Omni Heroes. If you're looking for a game that combines heroic fantasy with casual strategy, then you gotta check this one out. Omni Heroes is not just any RPG. It's a journey where you become an Omni Guardian, tasked with the noble quest to rescue the captive Valkyries from the clutches of demons. And this game's gotten recommendations on both the Google Play and App Store. In Omni Heroes, you summon legendary heroes at your command, you unlock powerful synergies, and you can craft hundreds of team compositions. And now they're introducing a brand new storyline and new battlefields, with new heroes making their debut. This is part of Omni Heroes' upcoming Season 4, Embark on an Eastern Adventure. Starting June 28th, Season 4 also brings new relics, roguelike dungeon gameplay, and an updated guild versus guild mode. The new storyline in Season 4 is inspired by Eastern mythology, and follows a deity who has lost his memory and descended to the mortal realm as a demon named Wukong, who then seeks out a human martial arts queen named Mulan, and an elusive panda deity. And throughout his quest, Wukong's divine nature reawakens. You'll get access to Wukong, Mulan, Panda, as well as Dahlia as new heroes. So don't miss out, download Omni Heroes through my link in the description or scan the QR code and join the mysterious Eastern adventure of Season 4. New players can claim 3 rounds of 999 free pulls, and returning players will get extra rewards from the special event Glorious Return. But before we talk about the mode itself, one thing about Season 5 PTR, the little storyline we play through in order to unlock the new mode, Infernal Hordes, seems to be a tie-in or an introduction to the story of the upcoming expansion, Vessel of Hatred. So for you narrative-focused players, prior to the release of Vessel of Hatred, I'd encourage you to, at least when Season 5 launches, play the beginning to get that little bit of story and lore. Because we're revisiting the Tomb of Sankakor. That was the High Priest of the Zakarum, who served as the host of Mephisto back in Diablo 2 days. I know you've all watched my lore videos and studied them, so you know that all by heart. So this mini-story ultimately leads us to facing off against some members of the High Council again, those former Zakarum priests who were corrupted into demons serving Mephisto. In Diablo 2, we fight them in that temple in Travancore. Right before going into the Durance of Hate, we fight some others actually in the Durance. And I love their portrayal in Diablo 4 so far. I feel they're actually elevated from their Diablo 2 status. They serve as the final bosses in the new Infernal Hordes game mode. There's 5 council members that the devs have built up, and we fight a random selection of 3 as the final fight in Infernal Hordes. I do like the boss fight. I think fighting 3 bosses at once leads to more interesting gameplay and mechanics than just fighting 1. I feel sometimes if a boss fight isn't over quickly, it kind of just evolves into a repetitive pattern. And when you just have 3 bosses at once, there's enough chaos going on that it doesn't become as repetitive so quickly. But one thing I gotta say, I haven't really felt a difference in which random selection of 3 I got. Basically, I didn't really feel an appreciable difference between the council members themselves. Now, this wasn't a negative experience, but it's something I only thought about after the fact, where it's like, oh yeah, the fight is supposed to be different each time, and I haven't really noticed that. Maybe it's just that I didn't do enough repetitions to really feel the difference. As for the Infernal Hordes mode as a whole, well, after getting to play it a bunch more than on day 1, again, I personally enjoy it. But I have concerns. So, first off, when it's too easy, the mechanics ultimately don't matter. You just farm it, it's not super interesting. But when you hit that sweet spot in difficulty where you feel like you are being challenged, but you still are ultimately able to win, the run takes maybe 15 to 20 minutes, then you are feeling the game mechanics, you are feeling the pressure of the monsters, you are feeling the weight of your choices. Again, after every wave, you get to pick one of 3 Banes and Boons. And so you really start to feel the weight of those choices and wanting to make the right choices. And you feel the effects of those choices. So it feels like your choices really matter, which is a good thing. Again, that's when I really enjoy the Infernal Hordes. Now, there seems to be some issue on PTR where some boss or even elite monsters just have way too much health. I feel like this must be a bug or something because it's just obscene. Things will be rather consistent in difficulty, and, you know, with some difficulty spikes, of course, but then come these absolute bullet sponge enemies that don't make any sense at all outside of some kind of a bug. So, assuming this is fixed, I do enjoy this sort of mini roguelite mode. Now, in my previous video, I was saying how the greed choices don't seem all that interesting. So again, you have 3 choices after every wave, you pick one of the 3. I define the greed choices as the ones that simply are related to the currency drops, right? You get this drop called Ether or Aether, and you use that at the end to buy rewards. At first, I thought that those choices surrounding the greed boons would not be interesting, but upon playing it further, I actually was having fun with a mini game of trying to maximize my ether at the end by synergizing my different boons together. Now that said, I would still have much more fun picking from cool build-altering boons, but I have to concede that I did enjoy picking between greed boons far more than I expected to. But here is where I am concerned about this mode. First off, it's not nearly rewarding enough. Like, by a mile. It's not even like it's almost there. It's nowhere in the ballpark. The rewards need to be increased by at least an order of magnitude, if not multiple orders of magnitude, just to justify the time investment. Now, that by itself, easy enough fix, right? Just tune some numbers, dial up the rewards. Well, even then, right now, if you fail, you basically get no rewards. So you can spend 20 minutes of your time, you fail to beat the bosses at the end, and then you get nothing for your time investment. Now, unfortunately, modern ARPGs are played by many gamers, myself included, as a game of efficiency. It's all about maximizing reward per hour. So why bother spending 20 minutes doing something that has a chance of failing and getting you nothing for your time when you can just do 20 minutes of whispers, 20 minutes of Blood Maiden farming, 20 minutes of pit runs instead, things that are consistently rewarding and not that challenging to accomplish. Or, more realistically, why bother playing the Infernal Hordes on a difficulty in which you may fail when you can just speed farm an easy difficulty that only takes 5 minutes to complete a run? So that's my concern with the Infernal Hordes. I fear that the only way the community will not hate this mode is if it's turned into an activity that can be farmed easily in 5 minutes, which completely negates everything interesting about this mode. Now, I don't know what the solution is to allow Infernal Hordes to exist as something that feels rewarding, feels good to engage with its mechanics in a meaningful way, feels satisfying to overcome as a challenge, and doesn't encourage players to run it as a brainless activity. Now, this activity seems vaguely inspired by roguelites. It's something that I myself and other people bring up quite a bit. The devs never said roguelite, but it feels like there's inspiration there. Games like Hades, for instance. And in games like Hades, you are going to fail. You're going to fail a lot. That's the point of the game. But because it is a roguelite and not a roguelike, every failure still allows you to make some progression that will help with subsequent runs. Roguelites are very challenging games that don't feel miserable to fail at because they reward failure. If the Infernal Hordes had some system like this, some system that made a failed run still feel like you were making progress towards an eventual successful run, like you didn't just waste your time, that could encourage people to challenge themselves in this mode rather than just farm it on lower difficulty. And the answer here can't just be loot drops, because loot drops are always an efficiency problem, and engaging in content that you're struggling with will just never result in maximum efficiency. So just off the top of my head, for instance, imagine what if your ether persisted after the Infernal Hordes mode ended. Right now, basically, if you don't spend all your ether, it just gets wasted. It disappears. When you come back in, you start at 0. So what if it didn't all go away? What if you failed to kill a council, then you can spend that ether in a little buff room to buy a permanent buff that would apply to every subsequent run in Infernal Hordes. Things like 10% damage reduction, 20% more life, extra revives, 10% more crit chance, whatever. This way, over time, eventually, everyone will be able to do tier 8, and eventually, everyone will be able to do tier 8 with some degree of efficiency. The question is just how long will it take you to get to the point where you're taking on tier 8, and how much do you need to rely on buying these extra buffs? Because the blasters with the top builds, they're going to be able to efficiently farm tier 8 before buying all the buffs, but the non-blasters will still be able to get there eventually, and this way we're not going to see people just going to farm those lower difficulties to be more efficient. Just a random idea there. I'm not suggesting that's the best implementation. It's just getting my idea across as an example of what might be a solution there. I just feel like we have a really interesting idea in Infernal Hordes, and I'm afraid of it turning into something either rejected by the community entirely or turned into something that loses the spirit of what makes it interesting. Now, one thing that I'm still unsure about, just from a design perspective, I don't understand how the devs see Infernal Hordes fitting into Diablo 4's gameplay loop. Is this supposed to be something that they want us to be able to do as often as we want, like, or as often as the pit, for instance, where you can get into a flow state of chain running these? Or do they want it to be something that's rarer, like doing Uber Duriel runs? And I see some players asking, you know, why do we have these compasses? Just remove the compasses, let us run this event as often as we want. And if that's the dev intent, if the intent is for us to basically get into a flow state of running it infinitely, then yeah, I would be in favor of dropping compasses altogether to avoid just inventory bloat. That said, I get the impression that the devs seem to want these runs to be rarer than that. I don't know whether I agree with preferring it that way or not, but I'm wondering if that's the intent, and I would like to see some clarity there. Now, outside of Infernal Hordes, probably the single greatest change on PTR is the ability to keep resummoning a boss after you've killed it. Talking about those Duriel runs, right? The altar just respawns now. You don't have to reset the dungeon. Not only does this save time, it saves frustration when playing with others and having to coordinate, okay, who didn't leave the dungeon? Okay, I'm resetting the dungeons. Okay, who didn't hit accept on the reset? It's just a huge quality of life improvement that's going to make running bosses so much better. The devs also squeezed in a bunch of other quality of life changes and UI changes. You can customize your combat text options now, so you don't have to constantly see vulnerable, 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 vulnerable on screen. You can turn on a compass as an on-screen option to point you the right way without needing to pop open your map. This also addresses the often requested overlay map. You can get your player health bar on screen now. Aspects in the codex now have unique icons and different colors. The temper icons on gear now more clearly show what category the tempers are. There's just been a ton of UI work this season that I really wasn't expecting and helps add that extra layer of polish to the game. But now, on to some bad news. Sorcerers. That is all. Yeah, from the moment the patch notes dropped, people were puzzled over the nerfs to Sorcerer and just the general approach to the balance changes. Now, obviously the changes to how cooldowns work on invulnerability powers would be a big hit to Sorcerers. And I do believe that that change was for the better of the game. And to clarify, cooldowns now begin once the power wears off rather than once the power activates. This is to prevent potential abuse cases where you can maintain 100% uptime on invulnerability powers with enough cooldown and things that give you extra cooldown. However, I figured, okay, if you're going to do this, you're going to account for this hurting sorcerers and therefore making up for it in some way. But the consequence is that a class that is already underpowered relatively, that had to rely on these shields, now has its survivability nerfed. Sorcerers run a bunch of defensive powers, and it's almost like the balance approach was, okay, we see that every Sorc build is using these same 3 skills. Let's break this meta by nerfing this, but that just results in sorcerers being squishier. And that wasn't the only thing. There was also a lot of perplexing damage nerfs. And once PTR went live and people actually got to test and not just Theorycraft, indeed sorcerers just weren't feeling great at all. The Incinerate build, for instance, which was not a top build, I mean, it was a top farming build for Helltide, but you're not going to push Pit with that. It suffered a 40% damage loss. Teleport had its cooldown increased. Offhand items, they don't have inherent cooldown reduction anymore. It's just puzzling to see the number of nerfs to a class that had like one good build for pushing Pit. It's being punished for it more than Barbarians are being punished, who consistently overperform every season. Now, I'm not someone who's opposed to nerfs. I am actually in favor of it. And I know that's an unpopular opinion and people don't like it when I say that, but I've consistently, since the Diablo 3 days, been in favor of nerfs and buffs. You look at what are the top builds, bring those down a bit, and then elevate the weaker builds. So to me, nerfing the top builds makes sense. Nerfing mediocre builds is just confusing to me. Meanwhile, we get some small buffs to things like Hydra that doesn't really do anything to make Hydra viable, because sorcerers simply lack the tools to properly scale damage into the late game as well as other classes. Even with a new Chain Lightning build, it's just not enough. Not enough damage, not enough survivability. Now, one positive way to look at this, I suppose, is, again, outside of that Firebolt Pit build as an outlier, sorcerer builds are actually pretty well balanced amongst themselves. If no other class existed in Diablo 4, the game actually would be in a pretty good state of balance. You would have a lot of viable builds to pick from as a sorcerer player. And this makes me wonder how balance is actually handled within Diablo 4. Does every class have a different balance team, and those balance teams are trying to ensure that every class has builds that are roughly equal in power? And then maybe there's some other layer of balance designers who are trying to ensure every class is roughly equal in power? So, like, has it been determined that Sorcerer is the most well-balanced class, and that's why they don't make drastic changes there? They're not going to super buff Sorcerers, and instead they're trying to balance the other classes around the Sorcerer? I really don't know. Because outside of that Broken Ball Lightning build in Season 2, which was caused by a bug, Sorcerers have just kind of consistently been mediocre. Now, that said, the devs, I believe, have expressed that they are aware of the problems that Sorcerers are facing, and will be working on long-term fixes. My concern is that Sorcerers are just left in a bad place in the meantime. A lot of players seem like they're not even going to bother playing Sorcerer in Season 5, and then when Season 6 comes around, well, with Vessel of Hatred, we're all going to be playing the new class, so that's at least 2 seasons where Sorcerers may not exist. Now, I'm going to end the D4 portion of this video on the note of the entire purpose of PTR is to get feedback so that the devs can act on that feedback before the launch of the next season, so I'm sure a lot of the stuff that has been brought up will be acted upon. There's just only so much the devs can do, however, with a month to go before the next season. Tweaking numbers is easy enough, but any kind of significant rework is likely not going to happen until the future. But I turn the question to you folks. How are you feeling about Season 5? Sound off in the comments. Then we got a trailer for Last Epoch's upcoming big update this week, Harbingers of Ruin, which launches on July 9th at 11 AM CST, and it's looking fantastic. This is patch 1.1, and with it comes, among other things, a new evade or dodge roll ability, the kind of thing that a lot of other modern RPGs have started to have. We're getting 30 new unique items, hundreds of balance changes, a new 4-phase pinnacle boss that looks absolutely sick. It's going to be the most difficult boss in the game to date, and to face him, you first have to defeat his Harbingers deep within the monolith. After you beat the first Harbinger, you unlock a new faction that you join called the Forgotten Knights. And you can also stay in either the Circle of Fortune or Merchant's Guild factions. The Forgotten Knights is just an extra faction that you're also part of. It serves as a new progression system that'll grant unique rewards for defeating Harbingers. I always love progression systems. They're also adding this new system called Nemesis, which looks great. You'll sometimes run into a special corpse, you interact with that corpse, and a window pops up with a few loot drops shown within it. You then have 3 options: Banish, Challenge, or Empower. If you select Banish, then those items disappear, and the next time you encounter this special corpse, it'll have new items. If you select Challenge, then the corpse comes to life, and if you beat it, you get those items as a reward. If you select Empower, the corpse comes to life, and if you beat it, you don't get those items yet. The next time you find the corpse, he'll have upgraded versions of those items. You can empower a total of 2 times. I like this system, adding some determinism to loot in a cool way. The devs are also changing their dynamic damage reduction system on bosses. If you aren't aware, of this mechanic. If you went into a boss fight and dealt huge damage, the boss's damage reduction would dynamically increase in order to allow the boss fight to last longer. The way this was implemented was deemed too punishing by a lot of players, so they're scrapping it entirely and they're introducing a different system instead to produce the same effect, a boss ward system. Once the boss reaches predetermined breakpoints, like once it's lost a certain percentage of health I presume, then it gains a burst of ward that'll decay over time. The longer the ward is present, the faster it'll decay. The result is that players with higher DPS will be able to take down the ward much faster than lower DPS builds, without just turning the bosses into bullet sponges. Overall, this patch is looking amazing. Elsewhere in the RPG news, Grim Dawn got a new patch this week, ahead of the upcoming expansion, no date yet on that, and No Rest for the Wicked put out a teaser for the Crucible. This will land on July 25th. Crucible is the endgame dungeon. We're expecting a big rework of it to turn it into a roguelite. Very hyped for that. Also, Diablo 3 announced its new season. Ethereal Memory starts on July 12th, and it's going to be a revisit of the season with ethereal items. Now, Elden Ring has seen quite a week. Its expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree, received amazing reviews from game journalists who had early access, and within 3 days of release, the game already sold 5 million copies. That's incredible for an expansion to sell that many that quickly. For comparison, Cyberpunk's Phantom Liberty expansion sold 5 million copies in 3 months. With Elden Ring, the base game having sold 25 million copies, having 20% of your player base already buy your expansion within the first 3 days is amazing, especially given you need to play about half of the base game before you can even engage with the expansion content. However, after release, the reviews on Steam were mixed, when everyone was expecting something overwhelmingly positive based on the journalist reviews. First off, performance issues. These are the most legitimate problems people had with both the PC and console version of the game. The devs had a long time to address tech issues that have existed in the base game, and they just didn't address them. That's legit criticism. Bad frame rates, stuttering, still no DLSS and FSR, lack of ultra-wide support, lack of unlocked FPS on PC, problems that can be solved through modding, but we shouldn't have to rely on modding for this. These all do detract from what is otherwise an excellent game. And a lot of Elden Ring fans are willing to look past these issues because the core game is so good. But outside of the performance complaints, another issue was clear in the Steam reviews. People were griping about the expansion's difficulty. And while yes, the bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree do seem faster on average than the base game bosses, they leave less openings for attacks, they continue long combo chains. A lot of the complaints, however, seem to come from a fundamental lack of understanding of the core mechanic of the expansion. You see, in order to ensure that Shadow of the Erdtree could be enjoyed by both players bringing in their super high-level characters that they already have, to those creating new characters, the way enemy scaling works is different in this expansion. In order to scale up power enough to take on the bosses in the expansion, you need to explore the world and collect MacGuffins. And the game basically explains this to you, telling you to seek out these things. However, the devs obviously massively overestimated the literacy level of the average gamer and their ability to follow instructions because, anecdotally, plenty of expansion players are slamming their heads, or were, against bosses rather than going to farm enough of those MacGuffins first. I've heard stories of people who get called in as those co-op helpers, only to see that the host that called them in is nowhere near qualified to be able to handle the boss fights based on how many MacGuffins they've collected. Now, in fairness, this is the first FromSoft DLC to implement something like this to handle difficulty. But still, seems a lot of the complaints about difficulty are largely attributed to a failure to engage with the core mechanic of the DLC. Again, not all the complaints. The bosses do also just seem on average more difficult in their mechanics. But the devs caved to player pressure. This week they released a patch that makes the first half of the DLC easier. The initial MacGuffin blessings you get will boost you significantly more, to the point that you can get through half the expansion without really going out of your way to look for more. The dev intent seemed to be that players would hit a wall of difficulty very early on, then decide to go out and explore the world in search of more power-ups, but instead players just kept beating their heads against the wall and then leaving negative reviews on Steam. We even saw mods starting to emerge on PC that mess with the difficulty. One mod, for instance, was called Journalist Mode to make the game easier. And the joke here is that video game journalists are bad at playing video games because in general, video game journalists or reviewers specifically, they have to play a lot of different games. They can never stick with one game long enough to become a real expert at it. So compared to a fan of a certain game franchise, an average video game journalist is likely to not be as good at that game. However, here's the irony. Video game journalists gave Shadow the Erdtree glowing reviews, and I didn't see any complaints about difficulty from those journalists. And journalism outlet VG247 had the best headline that I saw about this week's balance patch. Elden Ring balance updates make the first half of the DLC easier, so you don't have to be as good as games journalists. Now, on the topic of game difficulty, game director Miyazaki has been outspoken. In an interview with The Guardian, he said, quote, "If we really wanted the whole world to play the game, we could just crank the difficulty down more and more. But that wasn't the right approach. Had we taken that approach, I don't think the game would have done what it did. Because the sense of achievement that players gain from overcoming these hurdles is such a fundamental part of the experience. Turning down difficulty would strip the game of that joy, which, in my eyes, would break the game itself." While Elden Ring is the most casual-friendly From Software game yet, it still is anything but a casual game. And its success, despite its more niche appeal, is a testament to how good of a game it is. And Helldivers 2 CCO Pilstead called Elden Ring's difficulty choices 1000% good game design and reiterated his company's motto, "A game for everyone is a game for no one. Always cater to a select audience." Well said. That's going to wrap up this week's video, but do be sure to check out last week's video in which we discussed the full patch notes of Diablo 4 Season 5. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Special thanks to my supporters, and subscribe to join Rikers Raiders for more gaming content.